I think we should believe what Biden is saying in terms of his own personal views on whether or not the United States should defend Taiwan. But I wouldn't equate that to a declaration of policy.
That's the voice of James Lee, a postdoctoral research associate at the University of California Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now here are your co-hosts, Collina and Lauren Billett.
Thanks, Angela, and welcome back to Press the Button. I would like to take a moment to recognize the devastation and heartbreak that we are feeling after yet another mass shooting here in the United States. The tragic events in Texas are all too familiar, and it does not look like this will be the last time that we have to mourn the loss of innocent lives in a mass shooting like this. These attacks must stop and are yet another reminder that we need to change national policies to build a safer world.
Hi, Tom. Thanks so much for taking the time to say that. I totally agree with you, and my heart is still heavy from last week and all other similarly devastating events. And there is indeed a connection between our work at Plowshares Fund in the nuclear field as a whole and other peace and security fields. So speaking of, what nuclear updates do you have to share from this long weekend, Tom?
Well, turning to the ongoing war in Ukraine, the European Union took a big step in its economic fight with Russia. On Monday, the EU agreed to ban most Russian oil imports by the end of the year. Although technical details are still being worked out, EU leaders have agreed to ban seaborne oil imports from Russia. Now, this does leave a large potential loophole in pipeline imports from Russia. This is because Hungary objected to banning pipeline imports, so the deal does not cover those. But Germany and Poland have committed to limiting pipeline imports, and they're some of the largest importers over pipelines. So, if the EU sticks to the deal, EU leaders say that the ban would cover approximately 90% of all Russian oil imports into the EU, which is a pretty big deal. And of course, this is an attempt to starve Moscow of funding for its ongoing war in Ukraine. And due to the EU's dependence on Russian oil, this was a move that was considered to be impossible in the early stages of the Russian invasion. So progress is happening, which is good news. On the Iran front, according to media coverage of a leaked report by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, Iran, for the first time, has produced enough enriched uranium to make a nuclear weapon, if it were to choose to do so. If Iran wanted to make a bomb, it would still need to further enrich the material to 90% purity, which would take about 2 weeks. Iran would then need to integrate that material into a workable bomb design and develop a missile to deliver it, which could take a year or more. The key point here is that this process is reversible if the United States and Iran can revive the Iran nuclear deal. But that process has stalled out over political issues such as terrorism sanctions. But if the Biden administration wants to limit the political damage of a possible Iranian nuclear bomb, President Biden needs to get back into the deal as soon as possible. The IAEA Board of Governors will meet to discuss these issues on June 6th. Lauren, what do you have for us this week on early warning?
This week, Alex Hall sat down with Erin Rosenberg, a visiting scholar at the Urban Morgan Institute for Human Rights at the University of Cincinnati College of Law. They discussed the implications of the first war crimes charges brought against Russian soldiers for their actions against citizens during the war in Ukraine.
Then I sit down with James Lee. He's a research associate at the University of California Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation. We talk about President Biden and how he recently said the United States would defend Taiwan if China attacked, a statement which White House staff quickly corrected. But this is the third time that President Biden has pledged to defend Taiwan militarily. So we have to ask, has the policy changed? And if so, what does it mean? So please stay tuned for a great conversation.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us to improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early Warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thank you, Jacqueline. On May 23rd, Ukrainian judges sentenced Vadim Shishimarin, a 21-year-old Russian soldier, to life in prison, after finding him guilty for the war crime of killing a Ukrainian civilian. And on Thursday, 2 Russian soldiers pled guilty to shelling a town in eastern Ukraine. Erin Rosenberg is a lawyer specializing in international criminal law and reparations, who spent nearly a decade working at the International Criminal Court. She is now a visiting scholar at the Urban Morgan Institute for Human Rights at the University of Cincinnati College of Law and is joining me today to discuss this conviction. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Can you tell us about the significance of this first ruling? What precedent is there for it at a national court, and what precedent could it set?
Well, it's a very interesting case, and it's unusual for several reasons. The first being because it is a prosecution and a conviction that occurred while the conflict is ongoing. And that is typically unusual in terms of justice and accountability. The second aspect of it, which is also interesting and unusual, is that the proceedings were carried out in a civilian court as opposed to a military court, which is also unusual. What I think is important to stress is that the due process rights of the accused and now convicted person were, it appears, complied with. He had counsel defending him, and in fact, his counsel, I believe, has indicated he may even be potentially looking to appeal the sentence, though I'm not clear if he is going to move forward with that. His attorney was assigned by the Ukrainian government. The prosecution was able to take place because of Ukrainian domestic law, which permits the prosecution of war crimes in domestic civilian courts. And this is a recent development in Ukrainian law with the elimination of military courts happening several years ago. In terms of the precedent that it sets, I think that it sets a strong precedent within Ukraine itself and within the conflict itself, in the sense that it delivers a message to all actors that Ukraine is actively moving forward in terms of enforcing the rule of law and the law of armed conflict. In terms of a broader precedent that this might set, we will have to see. There are very real due process, fair trial right concerns around prosecutions happening in conflict of a belligerent force. There are issues that could arise in terms of the ability to gather evidence, to have witnesses testifying in your defense, etc. So I don't know that we can draw larger conclusions outside of this conflict itself.
So as you noted, this trial occurred against the backdrop of an ongoing war. So given the speed of this trial and ongoing investigations by both Ukraine and international partners, are you expecting to see prosecutions also occur at all from an international court?
This is just my own speculation, but I would be fairly surprised if we saw at the international level any type of actual prosecutions. In terms of the International Criminal Court, there are a number of procedural steps that are ongoing. It's important to understand that what's happening now is an investigation, which under the Rome Statute requires the prosecutor to investigate the entire situation. So this is actually a point that I really want to stress, is that the ICC is an independent, neutral, and impartial investigative and prosecutorial body, right? So that means that the prosecutor is investigating the entire situation, all sides, and it's why it's important as the conflict goes on that all sides, Ukrainian and Russian, and whether there are irregular forces, militia-backed, that may be supported by one side or the other, comply fully with the law. The ICC is not there investigating one side. All victims have a right to justice, and anytime a war crime is committed by any side, there is a need for accountability and justice. So just to say that where we are right now, the prosecutor in terms of the ICC is at the investigation stage. I don't see it moving into an arrest warrant or summons in the near future. I think what we probably are likely to see is the continuation of domestic prosecutions. We know that the prosecutor general has over 5,000 potential case files. And this has been through a number of portals that have been created by the Ukrainian government for example, civilians to submit information that they are then able to investigate, as well as other investigative steps that they've taken. So they have a number of cases. The question becomes one of being able to secure the suspect. And also, I would say that it is unlikely in terms of prosecutions, though we might see arrest warrants for higher ups while the conflict is ongoing. The reality is that what we're seeing right now is the prosecution of direct perpetrators. These are low-level individuals. These are not at this point moving up the chain of command.
I think that's a really key distinction to draw in terms of who we're going to see take responsibility for specific war crimes. So taking that step back to kind of this broader picture, what tensions do you see existing with ongoing investigations while there might be efforts to push for diplomatic or mediated end to the conflict?
This is a long-standing sort of tension that exists between peace and justice, and how do we approach that to see it not as a tension or a conflict, but rather ideally as something that is complementary. But in practice, that's very difficult. As you know, one of the prevailing theories of justice and accountability is that it has a deterrent effect, right? That is a theory that is not necessarily proven out. And so I think that's one of the issues that needs to be considered, is the degree to which essentially the way you evade justice, right? In that the opposite view would be that you actually make more efforts to win, and it can actually prolong conflict, right? When there is a threat of prosecution or accountability. And the idea being that if it is a victor's justice sort of political reality, then you put more effort even to winning, and rather than potentially peace negotiations. The other part of it, of course, and we've seen this at the International Criminal Court, and in a number of other settings, is the potential for amnesties in a peace agreement that might have some type of non-prosecution agreement attached to it. I think that, and I would just speak for myself, but I think that if I would say anything to the international community or those listening, is that what is most important in terms of that potential conflict is that those decisions really need to be led by the Ukrainian government in very broad consultation with the Ukrainian people. It should not be something that is imposed by the international community as an acceptable peace agreement. These are complicated and difficult questions, and some people will feel that in order to end the conflict, in order to end the atrocities that are happening, that they are willing to see their government, for example, enter into some type of non-prosecution agreement for certain actors. Other people will not feel that way. So it's really important that Ukraine have the space to really have that conversation itself of what is acceptable to the Ukrainian people, and then to support whatever position that may be.
Thank you so much, Erin. I think there are a lot of key aspects there we need to keep watching as this conflict unfortunately continues. And I really appreciate your emphasis on the victims-focused justice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Shing, the Communications and Marketing Specialist at Plowshares Fund. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has exposed just how close nuclear escalation and nuclear war can be. To meet the urgency of this moment, Plowshares Fund has launched a donation match challenge to make the largest grants possible to those who are working every day to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons. Right now, all first-time gifts will be matched dollar for dollar, and all new monthly gifts will be matched at their 12-month value. Or increase your giving and the full amount above your last gift will be matched. Go to plowshares.org/donate today. And thanks for listening.
When it comes to Taiwan, President Biden has a tendency to go off script, and he has done it again. In a May 23rd press conference in Japan, Biden said he would use military force to defend Taiwan if China attacked, breaking a long-standing U.S. policy known as strategic ambiguity. Biden said he would go further to defend Taiwan than he has for Ukraine. Now, to be clear, part of the reason the United States has not sent troops to defend Ukraine is that Biden has not, in his words, wanted to start World War III with Russia, which would presumably be a nuclear war. And it is not at all clear why this same level of prudent restraint would not also apply to a conflict with nuclear-armed China. And this is the third time that President Biden has said he would defend Taiwan militarily. And each time his staff has issued clarifications that the policy has not, in fact, changed. So at what point should we just take Biden for his word? And if the policy has changed, what would that mean? To help us understand what's going on here, we're joined by James Lee. He's a postdoctoral research associate at the University of California Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation. James, great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
So, James, first let's start with the basics. Can you explain U.S. policy on Taiwan and why President Biden's comments have attracted so much attention? What is at stake here?
The United States policy on Taiwan is defined by what is called the One China policy. And the main elements of that are that the United States only recognizes one Chinese government, which is the government of the People's Republic of China. And the United States relations with Taiwan are unofficial. And the United States does not support either unification or independence. The US considers Taiwan's status to be undetermined. And as part of the One China policy, the United States does not define in advance if or under what conditions it would intervene in Taiwan's defense. And that's considered to be an important part of the One China policy because there's the concern that if the US were to say, okay, we will defend Taiwan if China attacks, well, on the one hand, that might seem to deter China, but it might also seem to China like the United States is entering into an official relationship with Taiwan and treating Taiwan like an ally. And there's the other consideration that if Taiwan believes that it has the United States behind it, and that the US will definitely intervene to defend Taiwan, Taiwan might take provocative actions that would provoke China into using military force. So that latter possibility hasn't been a source of as much concern in recent years because the current government in Taiwan is very moderate. But if we look into the past and project into the future of Taiwan, that possibility is something that can't be ruled out. So that's one reason why proponents of strategic ambiguity favor that as an element of the status quo.
Now, Biden has gone off script on Taiwan before, and in his previous mischaracterizations, does he tend to change the policy the same way?
He generally does, and in three instances. So the first time was in August when he grouped Taiwan together with Japan and South Korea as having a NATO, in which the US had a NATO-like security commitment to each of these allies and partners. So including Taiwan along with Japan and South Korea seemed to put the US and Taiwan into a defensive alliance. And then the second time was, I believe, in September or perhaps a little later. But so when Biden, in response to a CNN town hall interview, was asked whether the United States would militarily defend Taiwan, Biden said, yes, we have a commitment to do that. And then most recently, when Biden was asked the same question, he responded with, yes, that's a commitment we made. So in the two most recent instances, Biden used similar language, and it all revolves around this equating Taiwan with NATO and the alliances with Japan and South Korea, when in fact that isn't the case.
And how have Taiwan and Beijing tended to respond to Biden's comments?
So Beijing is particularly upset and accuses the United States, as it always does, of violating its sovereignty. In the case of Taiwan, recently, Joseph Wu, the foreign minister, spoke with Mark Esper at a virtual event. And Joseph Wu was asked this question about whether Taiwan favors strategic ambiguity or clarity. And Joseph Wu said that Taiwan doesn't really have a preference. And what really matters is the substantive support the United States shows for Taiwan.
So every time the president mischaracterizes the position on Taiwan, the White House has clarified the president's comments. And how many times does the president have to say something for it to become de facto policy? In other words, at what point should we just believe what Biden is saying?
I think we should believe what Biden is saying in terms of his own personal views on whether or not the United States should defend Taiwan. But I wouldn't equate that to a declaration of policy, because the Taiwan Relations Act in Section 3, subsection 3C says that the president and the Congress shall determine in accordance with the constitutional processes appropriate action by the United States in response to any such danger. So Biden has his views, and what's different now is that we're getting some insight into the way that Biden himself thinks about these things, whereas in the past it was left unclear for the most part, and the president usually wouldn't publicly comment on how he or she would respond in this kind of event. But what we have now is a sign of how Biden himself thinks about it. But that isn't the same as a declaration of a change of policy.
So you're saying here it's not really just up to the president, but the president would also have to get the approval of Congress for any change of policy in this area?
Right, because the president had secured an authorization for the use of military force during the first Taiwan Straits crisis back in 54 to 55. And that was called the Formosa Resolution, but that expired, I believe, in 1972. And so the Taiwan Relations Act passed in 1979 said that Congress would have a say in whether or not the United States would intervene to defend Taiwan.
And is this above and beyond Congress's role in declaring war? Is this separate, or is it kind of the same idea?
I think it's the same idea. It's based on the idea that the Congress needs to authorize the president to use military force. The Taiwan Relations Act explicitly says that the president and the Congress shall determine in accordance with constitutional processes.
So let's talk for a minute about the parallels between Ukraine and Taiwan. A lot of people are drawing parallels, are drawing lessons between the two. What lessons do you think the United States, China, and Taiwan are drawing from the war in Ukraine?
I think the main lessons of the war in Ukraine are first that the supposedly mighty Russian military is not nearly as powerful as people thought it was. And Russia has seriously underperformed in Ukraine. And that should give a warning signal to Beijing that, especially since the People's Liberation Army has even less military experience than the Russian military has. China hasn't fought a war since 1979 and lost that one badly. So the Russian invasion of Ukraine should give Beijing a reason to pause before attempting some kind of similar maneuver against Taiwan. And the other side of it is that US, Western, and international support for Ukraine has been much stronger than what people anticipated. And so the combination of factors is how badly the war is going for Russia, how much the United States, its allies, and the international community have helped Ukraine, I think would, if anything, delay whatever timeline China has in mind for invading Taiwan.
Now, why would you think that President Biden would have less concern about a nuclear war with China than he does with Russia? Clearly, part of his restraint about the U.S. response in Ukraine was fears of direct conflict with Russia and possible escalation to nuclear war. His comments seem to indicate that he doesn't have the same concern with China. Why would that be?
Well, China has a much smaller nuclear force than Russia. And if you're Xi Jinping thinking about whether or not you decide to launch a nuclear strike, you look at China's nuclear forces compared to the United States nuclear forces, and trying to go toe-to-toe with the United States is only going to end badly for China. And China has threatened to use nuclear weapons against the United States before. It threatened that during the third Taiwan Straits crisis, and the US called China's bluff on it and still sent the carriers at the strait. So there's that factor. But I think another major factor is that the US relationship with Taiwan has a much longer history. And I mean, this goes back all the way until 1949. And Taiwan is very important for the United States, both from a geographic perspective, if you think about Taiwan's role in the first island chain, and also the importance of Taiwan's computer chip industry for the US military and US industry.
One other aspect of this that is interesting is, in terms of the lessons, is how Russia used nuclear threats as a cover for its conventional invasion of Ukraine. Could you foresee China using nuclear threats as a cover for its possible invasion of Taiwan in the same way?
I think it's possible they would make that kind of threat, and that's what they did in 1995, 1996. I believe the PRC representatives said something like, "You won't trade Taipei for Los Angeles," but Clinton sent the carriers anyway. So I don't think it's inconceivable that they would make that kind of threat if there were an actual conflict over Taiwan, but I don't think they would be likely to escalate to the nuclear level.
So last question on this. Give us your sense of what this all means for the U.S.-China relationship. At the end of the day, is a U.S.-China conflict more or less likely as a result of the war in Ukraine?
I think it's less likely, both for what you might call the rational reasons of international support for Ukraine, Russia's serious underperformance, and what that would mean potentially for Beijing trying to invade Taiwan. And there's also what you might call the non-rational aspects, because so in theory, Taiwan's always been under this kind of a shadow of a war, potential Chinese invasion. But there's kind of a non-rational element, which is now that the people are seeing the images of the war in Ukraine, and it's hitting home that, okay, this isn't just an abstract possibility, it's a concrete potential scenario that Taiwan might have to face at some point in the future. And so that means Taiwan is studying the war in Ukraine, it's getting ready, it's potentially lengthening the duration of conscription. And so that has galvanized Taiwan to prepare in a much more systematic way for potential Chinese invasion.
James, fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Of course, thank you.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett, Angela Kellett, and Alex Hall. Audio engineering in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyric Spawn and Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.